Globally, the Billionaire Club is extremely exclusive, with fewer than 3,000 individuals. At each level, it becomes even more exclusive. Fewer than 200 people have fortunes between $10 and $100 billion, and only about 9 individuals exceed $100 billion. Within this elite circle, wealth is dramatically concentrated. At gatherings like the World Economic Forum in Davos, ultra-high net worth individuals interact and collaborate within circles that few outsiders ever penetrate. In contrast, approximately 60 million people are millionaires, each holding assets ranging from $1 to $10 million. However, the term millionaire has lost some of its appeal as inflation has significantly eroded the purchasing power of $1 million. In many developed countries, simply crossing the $1 million threshold does not necessarily equate to experiencing substantial wealth. In the West, many who have spent decades paying off a mortgage on appreciating property now achieve millionaire status. But that's a very different playing field. Why did I tell you all that? I told you all that because I'm going to show you a graph, the Lorenz Curve. You see the line of equality on the graph. It's a 45-degree straight line. If every individual earned exactly the same income, the Lorenz curve would equal the line of equality. In reality, however, the curve bends away from this line because in most societies, there's an average income and people's incomes are distributed around that. So the more people we have on both ends of this spectrum, the more the Lorenz curve bends away from the line of equality. So the very small billionaire club is on the right-hand side above the 99th percentile, and the people who have nothing are in the leftmost percentiles. And as we move rightward along the curve from these leftmost percentiles, we accumulate very little income in the beginning. The Gini Coefficient, whose calculation many find a bit confusing, can be thought of as a score that tells us how much the Lorenz curve bends away from perfect equality. Approaching it this way can make the Gini coefficient easier to grasp. When the coefficient is 0, the Lorenz curve coincides with the 45-degree line of equality. When it's closer to its maximum value of 1, it means the curve has bent significantly, with only a few people having a lot and many people having very little. But these extreme cases have probably never occurred in history. For instance, Scandinavian countries like Sweden often have a Gini coefficient around 0.25, reflecting relatively low income disparity, whereas some Latin American countries register coefficients about 0.5, highlighting a more pronounced inequality. Relatedly, this is the elephant curve. They call it that because it somewhat resembles an elephant viewed from the side. On the x-axis, people from across the planet are arranged from the lowest to the highest income percentiles. As we move rightward toward higher percentiles, we progress from the working class to the middle class, then to the upper class, and eventually to the wealthiest. However, these are global units and global classes, not the working or middle or upper class of any single country. Everything's on a global scale. To help understand the elephant curve correctly, I'll cite a few data points from it. The global median income is estimated at about $8 per day, purchasing power parity. The global median household income is $3,000 per year. The entry point to the 99th percentile, global 1%ers, is $45,000 per year. The average income within the 99th percentile is $71,000 per year. If you use these reference points, you'll interpret global data more accurately and position yourself more precisely on the scale. You'll also make more accurate comparisons between the developing and developed worlds, having learned about their different standards. The y-axis on the elephant curve shows the percentage increase in income. That's not how much people earn globally, but how much their income grew from 1988 to 2008 during the early era of globalization. The bottom 5 percentiles appear to have gained almost nothing from globalization. Beyond that, however, something shifts. People from approximately the 10th to the 20th percentile, with incomes ranging from roughly $600 to $1,100 per year, saw significant income growth in real terms adjusted for inflation. Milanovic identifies this group as one of the main beneficiaries of globalization. People between the 20th and 65th percentiles, with annual incomes still in the 4-digit range, saw the highest income gains. Milanovic suggests they are the new global middle class, primarily in China, although the categorizations and placements are debatable. Beyond the 65th percentile, gains taper off and even dip below zero around the 80th percentile. From that point through the 90th percentile, income gains remain low but above zero. We must remember that with the 80th percentile, we're entering the 5-digit income territory, and the 90th percentile marks the territory of the working classes in the developed world. At these levels, income gains are positive and build upon already high global baselines, but are not as high as those of the emerging global lower and middle classes. Although the sharp uptick after the 80th percentile is noteworthy. The rise continues up to the 99th percentile, which corresponds to the global 1% zone. Milanovic refers to this group as the global elite, but acknowledges that much of the growth in the top 1% is driven by the extreme gains of the super rich, rather than uniform gains across this percentile. However, this may not be of much importance on a global scale, as the middle classes in the developed world still qualify as global 1%ers, and many, if not most, are even above the inflated average. Maybe at this point we should take a look at global income on the world map, and let's see how we got here. Look at how it was in the 80s and watch which countries turn green over time. Notice how the emerging markets are less stable, lighting up green only to fall back down. In contrast, developed countries remain consistently stable. Let's see how many in Latin America and Asia eventually catch up, while the same subgroup of countries in Africa still lags far behind. Now that you have a better sense of what income distribution looks like on a global scale, we can look at the global bottom 50% and the top 10% in wealth and income. The figures significantly favor the global top 10%. This huge gap probably should not be very surprising given the earlier distribution on the x-axis. The earlier figures covered only income though. Therefore, to cover the wealth side of things, let's start with the above figure of 771,000. That's the average wealth of the global top 10%. If we're talking about the global top 1% in wealth, then the entry level is currently a little below $1 million. There are 8 billion people on the planet. 1% of that is 80 million. We don't have 80 million millionaires in the world. We probably have about 63 million. But you have to have close to $1 million to be at the entry level of the global top 1% in wealth. Globally, there's 1 millionaire per 130 people. In the US, 1 per only 13. In Canada, 1 per 22. The Billionaire Club is different, however. It can't be measured in percentiles. There's only 1 billionaire per 2.7 million people. The United States has the highest number of billionaires in the world. There's 1 billionaire per 454,000 people, 1 in every town. In Canada, there are 63 billionaires, so 1 per 635,000 people. Not very different, but always lagging behind the United States, of course. Perhaps complementing these figures is UN data, which indicate that in 1820, 80% of inequality was class-based, whereas by 1950, the situation had completely reversed, with 80% of inequality becoming location-based. These figures aren't very precise, and the exact percentages depend on the methodology used, but It's a well-established fact that the global inequality began to increase dramatically in the 1800s with the Industrial Revolution. And by the 1900s, disparities between nations began to dominate. Being born in an industrialized or post-industrial country now makes the most difference. That was at the time the Western world, and to a large extent, it still is the Western world, meaning Western Europe, North America, Australia, and New Zealand. In the 21st century, however, power has been shifting primarily to Asia. One good way to assess where wealth is concentrated in the world is by examining stock market capitalization. Markets with the highest market capitalization in the world, those above $5 trillion, are in only 4 countries. Number 1 by far is the United States, then come China, Japan, and more recently, India. Just 4 countries. Between $2 and $5 trillion, we have Canada, France, the United Kingdom, Saudi Arabia, Germany, and Taiwan. Including the earlier 4, that's 11 economies in total. That's where wealth is currently concentrated. These are the market indices commonly displayed across most traditional and digital media. Even the largest stock exchanges in Latin America and Africa fall quite short of the capitalizations of these global markets. Brazil's B3 is the largest stock exchange in all of Latin America, if you include Brazil under that umbrella term. B3 is an important regional stock exchange, but it's not global by any measure. It's actually the 21st in the world. South Africa is a few steps above at number 18. That's one of the reasons why the IMF doesn't consider them part of the global north, because their financial markets are not as international. At this point, one meaningful question is, where's the other end of the spectrum? Who's experiencing extreme poverty? And where are they located at? The World Bank data reveal that we're looking at a phenomenon that's largely African, with notable pockets still persisting in Latin America and Asia. More than 600 million people globally live in extreme poverty. This figure has significantly declined over the past 2 decades. While this represents substantial progress, it's crucial to interpret these figures accurately. To understand extreme poverty, we must first define it. The World Bank established this measure by categorizing the world into 4 income-based contexts: low income, lower middle income, upper middle income, and high income. For each context, the World Bank calculates the minimum income required to afford basic necessities like food, clothing, and shelter. In low-income contexts, this threshold is set at $2.15 per day, or about $65 per month. In lower middle-income countries, the threshold is set higher at $3.65 per day. Individuals earning less than this amount are considered to be in extreme poverty. When someone's income rises above this threshold, for example from 60 to 70 or 80 per month, they graduate from extreme poverty to poverty. Analytically, this means they have crossed the World Bank's income threshold for basic necessities. That said, we need context before we assign any meanings to these dollar figures. In sub-Saharan Africa, for example, a rural family surviving on $60 per month may struggle to secure sufficient food and basic health care. Even a modest increase to $80 can lead to tangible improvements: better nutrition, minor home repairs, or the ability to send children to school. Yet the family would still be classified as living in poverty. So the ongoing reduction in extreme poverty marks progress, but it should not be mistaken for a comprehensive solution, especially when over 600 million people worldwide continue to endure severe hardship. One good way to educate ourselves on these nuances is the Dollar Street Project, which took a unique approach by photographing 264 households across 50 countries to reveal what daily life really looks like at different income levels. The project revealed something quite interesting. The quality of life seems to depend more on how much money you have than where you live, underscoring the vital importance of context. In other words, richer people around the world tend to enjoy similar lifestyles, whether they're in the developed or the developing world, while lower income households face similar challenges regardless of their geographic location. Anna Renlund, the founder of the project, explains how these visual comparisons help us understand poverty in a way that raw statistics cannot, and how, by looking at everyday objects and living conditions, we get a much clearer picture of what it really means to struggle with limited resources. Anna Rosling Renlund is the co-founder of the Gapminder Foundation, with her father-in-law, the late Hans Rosling, the Swedish professor and the author of the bestseller Factfulness, which I recommend. And that's his visual data demonstration that went viral years ago. I'll include a link in the description to the book and the videos mentioned. Back to the point, besides the World Bank's poverty thresholds, there's another widely used non-monetary measure of development called human development, which considers factors such as life expectancy and years of schooling. Every year, the UN Development Programme releases human development reports with index scores to assess poverty. Measuring human development is not straightforward, and the formulas have been refined over time and controversies exist. Regardless, this map also highlights the realities of the same regions around the globe. The three-part diverging color scale used here distinguishes the two extremes using dark red and dark green regions. On one side, there is pronounced poverty in sub-Saharan Africa and a few other regions. And on the other, there are regions that have achieved high level of development as well as regions striving to get there. On the green side of the globe, in addition to the global north, the four Asian tigers and the GCC countries, we consistently observe the same small group of emerging markets. Always the same group of countries show up. Chile in Latin America, Thailand and Malaysia in Asia, and Turkey in the Middle East to cite some. And that leaves out a lot of countries because there's about 50 or 60 developed countries at best, depending on how narrowly you define the concept. And there are only a handful of others who have joined the developed club or seem to have the potential to join soon. There are not many candidates for that status out of a world of more than 200 countries and territories, and that's a problem. But why is this such a prolonged problem? Why did some countries achieve development whereas others didn't? That's a question that troubled many scholars over the years, and I'll cover two major theories that emerged, one favored mostly by the left wing and the other mostly by the right. First, modernization theory is rooted in liberal ideas of progress. It argues that to achieve development, traditional societies must adopt modern values and institutions, such as a free market economy, foreign direct investment, technology, and similar practices. According to this framework, societies transition from traditional to modern, pre-industrial to industrial, and agrarian to mass production systems. This theory has been criticized primarily for treating Western history as a blueprint for all societies. Critics argue that the theory reduces development to a universal linear model, assuming all societies will follow more or less the Western path as they transition from traditional into modern. That approach also tends to prescribe Western values, institutions, and practices to reach the ideal endpoint of development, so critics regard it as dismissive of alternative paths to development and as a simplification of complex local processes, whether social, economic, or cultural. Besides, countries like Japan and South Korea industrialized rapidly while maintaining distinct cultural and political structures, challenging the idea that Western-style modernization is the only path forward, and showing that alternative models of development do exist. Later scholars revised some aspects of modernization theory. In the 1950s and 60s, many post-colonial developing countries didn't experience the economic growth or democratization as the theory predicted. Instead, democratization often coexisted with or even revitalized traditional elements which adapted rather than disappeared. So, revisionists argued, in traditional societies, Landowners used to provide protection or resources to peasants in exchange for their labor or loyalty, with relationships shaped by kinship or tribal ties. Under modern democratic systems in democratic countries, these dynamics took on a different form. Today, politicians or business elites offer jobs, welfare, or services in exchange for votes or loyalty. Informal networks can be political or economic and often bypass formal institutions, perpetuating patron-client relationships and clientelism. In other words, traditional practices adapt to modern institutions, and that's challenging the assumption that Western-style modernization can erase local realities. Second, dependency theory is a Marxist approach to development. It raises a completely different argument about why some countries have achieved development while others have not. It argues that development and underdevelopment are two sides of the same coin. In other words, the development of the developed world depends on the underdevelopment of the developing world due to the exploitative relationship between them. Put differently, colonialism may have ended, but the relationship between the colonizer and the colonized has not changed much, because similar structural processes remain at play. Dependency theory characterizes this as a core-periphery relationship in today's world, where developed countries are at the core of the global economy and the developing ones are at the periphery. The core is industrialized, engages in advanced production, and dominates global trade. The periphery still serves the core. It sends raw materials to the core, imports manufactured goods, and remains dependent on the core, thereby perpetuating its underdevelopment. In other words, the exploitative dynamic of colonialism still persists today. It's probably a different kind of structural exploitation, but it's still structural exploitation. Based on this perspective, some theorists offered more radical solutions. They argued that the global south should cut off ties with the north, cease participating in global markets, and instead engage in cooperation with each other rather than with core countries. However, these radical solutions subsided after the emergence of the four Asian tigers, which demonstrated that it's actually possible for developing countries to achieve development while remaining integrated into global markets. One could argue that, like modernization theory, dependency theory too fails insofar as it proposes only one path and dismisses alternatives. Similarly, another common criticism of dependency theory is that it attributes all blame for underdevelopment to external factors, ignoring domestic factors, which vary across countries and likely play a role in development and other outcomes. I'll end this review with a third perspective as Gerschenkron, 1962. This classic work doesn't specifically focus on why development lags in some countries. Instead, it puts industrialization in historical perspective and argues that economically backward countries do not simply mirror advanced models of industrialization. They follow divergent paths as they pragmatically look for ways to remedy their situation, and the solutions they devise shape the speed, structure, and mechanisms of industrialization. Gerschenkron contrasts the industrialization of Britain with a number of cases in Europe. The United Kingdom is not only an early industrializer, it's the first industrializer. Britain is the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, with different cities on the island emerging with distinct industries. Then come Belgium, the United States, and others. But in these early efforts, investments were made largely by private capital, and the state didn't have to get involved. Gerschenkron contrasts this privately funded early industrializer experience of the United Kingdom with that of other European cases, primarily Germany and Russia. Germany was a backward economy. Russia was an extremely backward economy. Germany was a late industrializer, and Russia was a very late industrializer. Germany had limited private capital, Russia had very limited private capital. So in Germany, they looked for ways to solve this problem and came up with innovative banking systems. because you cannot industrialize without capital. And if you don't have capital, you need to find ways to accumulate it. Banking became one solution, and it worked for Germany. In Russia, however, there was so little private capital that banking wouldn't work. So the state stepped in. The key takeaway here is profound, as expected from a classic work. A country's degree of economic backwardness shapes the necessary institutional responses. So, circumstances and options, rather than ideology. In fact, as Gerschenkron notes, each country finds ways to justify its compelling policy choice in some way. One may argue that's what institutions do anyway. Institutions engage in innovation, adapt policies, stretch ideologies, and shape people. Institutions create individuals who embrace these ideologies, and both the institutions and the ideologies eventually take on a life of their own, outliving the conditions that created them. In the colonialism episode, we covered a few cases where framing took on a life of its own, even after the framers or their regime were long gone. So it's not easy for most people to outgrow their preconceived notions. One policy may have solved a problem in a particular place at a particular time, or one person, or one idea, but only to take on a life of its own and become a greater problem than the one it once solved. As humans, we usually lack full context, and even when we have it, it's difficult for even people who are highly educated in one field to navigate the complexities of human societies and their organization, not to mention the specific experiences that shape them. That's perhaps why ideological fights are more common than efforts to realize why we approach things the way we do. So I'll end on this positive note.